Quilts REDUX.
Happy Monday. Oh my goodness. Thanks, Druid. So, Druid and Robin are here. Robin, I'm so sorry to hear your granddaughter's having surgery. Oh my goodness. I hope it's not like pleurisy. I know that's really rough. I'm just having the grandkids. Bless you. I hope everything's okay. We'll be definitely praying for her. It's Monday already. I hope you guys had a wonderful weekend. My weekend was not very productive. My poor husband is sick again. So, yeah. that should just about explain it. I'm getting ready for seminar. I have to leave at the end of this week for a family thing, and then on my way back home, I'm stopping at my mother's house, and then we leave for seminar a week from tomorrow. So, I have a lot to do in the next few days. So Friday, I went to see the Amish Quilts, as you know. It was a wonderful experience. I got to see, I think it was a total of 22 out of the 82 quilts that are in the collection. And I learned a bunch of interesting stuff, and I learned some things I think that I probably need to correct some stuff I said the other day. So I thought we would do that today, and I have a couple things to read, and then we'll catch up with Mavis Fitzrandolph, because I missed her on Thursday. We didn't get to pick up where we left off. So let's talk about the Amish quilts. So first of all, let me give you a couple of links. So the LancasterHistory.org, I'm going to drop that in the chat. So this is who currently owns the quilts. They're in their collection. But the story of the quilts coming back is kind of interesting. There were some aspects of it I just did not know/remember. So I have a book I'm going to read a little snippet out of, so that, because I think it's best said in the author's words and me not try to fumble through it. But yeah, seeing the quilts was, and what was really interesting is a whole bunch of the quilts I'd pulled out of the big book and shown you guys the other day were quilts that my dear friend who did the quilt turning had chosen. And she was trying to choose ones out of the collection that were interesting looking and unique. And I guess great minds think alike, because that was my strategy when I was flipping through the big book. So 82 quilts. And real quick before I forget, so let me just show you the book that I really highly recommend. This is Amish Quilts of Lancaster County by Patricia Herr. It is a Schiffer book, so you know it is good stuff. Oh no, Robin. Okay, pneumonia with pleurisy. Oh, yeah. I had pneumonia with pleurisy when I was about 3. So I guess the good thing is, if I survived in 76, medical science is a lot better today. So, yeah, but we'll be thinking about her. Poor little thing. Yeah, I'm sure you could probably hear him hacking in the background. So between COVID, cold, flu, this is a yucky season. So this book was written when the quilts came back to Lancaster. And Patricia Herr, I have a number of her books. She was a fantastic writer. She, if what I read about her is correct, she was actually a veterinary person. Like, she was, I don't know if she was a researcher or like literally a veterinarian, but she had an advanced degree, and she and her husband were collectors and researchers, and they lived in the Amish and Mennonite communities, and she knew Amish people. So she was definitely, among several other women, really knowledgeable and kind of the expert in that area. So she was also instrumental in getting the quilts back to Lancaster. So unfortunately she died in 2023, but this book is fantastic. I'm going to give you a link to the book on Amazon. This is not an affiliate link or anything, just so that you can get the details on it if you would like this book. It is available on Abe, much cheaper. So, you know, just to check it out and get like the ISBN and stuff. What is really cool about this book is she covers all of the quilts, and the pages are of course smaller than the ones that are in the big book, but I think the pictures are just as good, if not better, because these pictures were taken, I think, probably at a later time. Unless I'm wrong, I don't think that they're the exact same pictures that were in the big book, the Julie Silber, Robert Hughes book. But the thing that is really cool about this book is she shows the backing fabric, which, you guys, some giant surprises in there. So she shows backing fabric. I think on every single quilt she shows the backing fabric. And she also shows details where she points out, and you can see here on this page over here where my hand is, she's got details where she points out some specific things. So fantastic book. And like I said, go to Abe. I feel really bad when I say that, like, but you know, if you're trying to amass a library for research and reading about quilts, it gets expensive. So it's as far as I know, it's not out of print. And I bought this copy directly from the museum to support them. They were really generous and gave us a discount. So I didn't pay full price, but I'm going to give it to somebody as a gift. So I don't want to crack it open too much. But my dear friend, something she did specifically for me was she gave me a copy of her little like cheat sheet that she used of the pictures that were in the book mapped to what she pulled out to show. So I was able to, I can look in here and map the quilt. So what I did is I just grabbed a couple of them. We'll look at them. That I showed you the other day. So we're looking at, again, pictures I pulled out of the big book, and I'll just tell you a couple things about them that are interesting. And then, in a case of asking for forgiveness and not permission, I took some pictures of the backs, just a handful of them, because I was shocked what I saw. And I don't think that this is stepping on the museum's ability to be, you know, to keep showing these. It's just 6 pictures and just little snippets. But yeah, for sure, grab that book. If you are interested in Amish quilts at all, this book is fantastic. So, a couple of things that I've learned, and let me just pull up the quilts we looked at the other day, and so we can just get into the conversation. And I can tell you about some of the things that I was just so interested to learn. So, this was the first quilt we got to look at, and it's a good one. We looked at this on Thursday, and you know, my friend who did the turning, she confirmed that, you know, all of these things that we looked at and that I pointed out are your very common devices or imagery that are used in the quilting. And she said that basically the 3 things that you're going to commonly see in Amish quilts, because they utilize these same patterns over and over, are feathers, flowers, and stars. And we've got this right here. And I know that some of you are interested in bindings. So what I can tell you about all of the quilts that we saw, except for one, had applied bindings. And they are actually fairly wide binding. They're kind of what, you know, you often see in modern quilts or contemporary quilts. People tend to use that wide double fold thickness. Now, I don't know that these were always, or even any of them were double fold, because I couldn't touch them. You have to kind of feel it to see if it's double fold, but they're very wide. They're like 1.5 or 1.25 inches. So, or 3/4 of an inch, give or take. So That's one thing that I found was really interesting. And a lot of times that binding has nothing to do with the color of the backing, has nothing much to do with the front of it sometimes. So like in this case, it's a darker kind of purpley oxblood sort of color, and it's just different from these other purpley and maroon colors. And like, ask the question why, who knows. I think, and also she dispelled some of some of those myths. One of them that I will just now dispel was what we read in the big book the other day, was that yellow is not used by the Amish. And the theory was that yellow might be too flashy, too not plain. And that's not actually true. They just don't use yellow. And I don't know if there's no rule against it. It's and I think I remember talking about what I know is that there's the Ordnung, which is like kind of the religious rules of the community, but the leadership of the community also come up with things that the community can and can't do. And I mentioned the one that really stood out to me was the scooters that they ride up in like the Bird in Hand area versus bicycles down in Southern Maryland. So those are examples, and it's like it's nothing in their religious rules that say thou shalt not ride a bicycle or thou shalt not wear or sew with yellow. It's just a thing. Actually, little girls do often wear a yellow, but I think it's more of like a buttery yellow than like a bright neon yellow. So that that being a myth that was kind of not exactly true, that was in the big book. And the same thing with white. I asked the question, and I said, well, my hypothesis is kind of not to use white because it gets dirty, it's hard to keep clean. And she said, no, not really. It's just, the women do not wear white dresses. And so much of this fabric is, it's the clothing fabric. And, what she said is, the difference between the Amish using clothing scraps and sort of the rest of everybody using clothing scraps is, the theory that, our mothers and our grandmothers who quilted, may have bought yardage and made a dress or, some kind of outfit out of it. And then those scraps then become quilt fodder. Whereas the Amish, knowing that they're going to make a certain number of quilts, a certain number of garments, would buy an entire bolt of fabric and tear off what they, cut off what they might need for quilting, and then, make dresses out of the rest. And then there might be still some scraps. So sometimes when you see those mismatches, it could be a possibility where they ran out of, last year's blue dye lot and had to put in some of this year's blue dye lot. And so that's where you'll see what looks like massive mismatches. A lot of times might be same colors were used, but one of them had an unstable dye lot, which, a fugitive dye or a dye that faded out. So there are a couple quilts that really do look like they've got some random stuff going on, but it's really a case of the dye in the fabric changing. So that was one thing that I think I probably hadn't given much thought to, but that's why you might see some quilts that are kind of oddball. And then let's see what else. I actually had some notes here. So I talked about the backies. Batting. We didn't talk about batting a whole lot, but I know there was one question I think about batting, and they purchased batting just like anybody would have. They used a very, very thin batting. I don't know there was anything like super interesting there. Talked about the binding. There was one quilt, I think it was it a front to back to front? I can't remember now. But it was only one example, and that one would have been kind of a rare thing because they did typically use these applied bindings. The other thing about binding is it's a 4-step binding. Now, I don't think this is 100% of the time, because I think we did see one quilt that had where they had turned corners with the binding. But basically what they do is, your finished quilt sandwich, it's all quilted, squared up, you put a binding strip on the top, a binding strip on the bottom, turn them, stitch it down, then binding strips on the sides, stitch them down, turn it, stitch the back. So that's how they get those nice square bindings. They don't do mitered corners. The one I did see that did have mitered corners was not it was not very skillfully done. And I mean, you see that all the time in older quilts where, and I too am not good at it. So you'll see where it doesn't make that nice sharp like mitered corner. It kind of is sort of a wonky, sort of rounded, sort of spread out. So that was the one quilt I saw that was like that. Oh, the little device, and I was just getting ready to look it up and I got sidetracked, but let me draw it for you because we looked at it, but I think that the pictures kind of don't do it justice because it's really hard to see. So this sort of thing, and actually let me just switch back real quick to my big picture so you can see what I'm showing. So this this is badly drawn, but you see it's like 4 petal shaped things and they almost look like a paisley that kind of flip to the side. That is called, and after she said it I was like, oh, I've heard of that before, a fill thought. And if it's more pointy and just sort of like a seed shape, it's called a pumpkin seed. And it's just a filler. And I think the idea of the fill thought, that is coming from, I think, those like hex marks. I think that it's just a shape. It's you know, it does. I don't think it has any like really major symbolic meaning. So that was interesting. Let's see. This one, one thing that was interesting about this one is that it had a machine binding. And a number of the quilts definitely had, you know, machine construction and also machine binding, and not just like when I put binding on, I attach the first side by machine, and then when I, you know, flip it around or fold it around to the back, then I'll hand stitch that. But there were some that were clearly machine bound both turns. So, you know, they turned it and then machine bound the back side. And so the stitching that will come to the front side when you do that, the reason why I don't stitch both passes for binding on my machine is because I can never get that back, you know, the fold over. I can never get it like nice and neat, you know, and it shows on the front. And it just looks messy. So that's why I don't use that. But they had done this on at least one of the quilts that she pointed out, and I suspect that there were more of them because there was definitely machine quilting or machine binding. But they very skillfully did that. So, but I think everything, all of the quilting is hand quilting. I can't think of anything that was machine quilted. I'm racking my brain here. I don't think there was anything. Everything was hand quilted. So let's move on to another one. Got to see this one. This one was, let's see, this was number 4. Oh, this is interesting. So the Irish chain is accomplished by, so you've got, it's basically a 25, I'm sorry, it's right here, a 25 patch. So it's 5 by 5. And then the alternate patch is right here. And I release, let's see. Can I draw on this? This doesn't have drawing settings, does it? Boo! Oh, wait a minute, maybe it does. Let's see if we could try this. I can make this more clear. And so we're going to find out how horribly this works. Here, markup. Maybe that'll let me. Okay. So you've got your 25. Oops. I'm drawing on the wrong thing. Undo. Okay. So you've got your 25 patch right here. I kind of did that badly. And then the alternate block is this right here, this solid patch with these 4 bits in the corners. Oh, sorry. Thanks, Robin. I forgot that I had put myself on the screen. Okay. So look what I did. So here, and I kind of did a bad job with this one, but this is the 25 patch, right? And then here is the alternate block that is just like a big solid with these 4 pieces in the corners. Those 4 blocks in the corners are appliqued on. So the 25 patch is pieced as expected, but these alternate pieces, because they would have to piece this with like a rectangular strip there, and so they just skipped all that and put in, just appliqued in these little pouches. That was interesting. I did not expect that. Okay, come on. Let's see what else. So this one had a cotton sateen back. I think it was like kind of a celery green, and like many contemporary quilts, I know in modern quilts, people will use, big bold stuff on the back that has nothing to do with the piecing on the front. And I kind of feel like in some ways, that's what they were doing. They knew the back wouldn't be shown unless it was one of those 2-sided deals. They knew the back wouldn't be shown. And so it was kind of like, whatever I think was probably economical to use on the back. Yeah. The H quilt. So this one, let's see, number 7. This one surprised me because this picture does not do it justice at all. In person, the fabrics are really almost a different color. Particularly these here, these H's, they are actually more of like a gold colored fabric. And I think it's a fabric that it's either like a satin or a glazed fabric, because it's golden color and it actually looks like metallic fabric, even though it's not. But it looks, when you look at it from a distance, because it's kind of got a sheen to it, and it is like just this like really golden color. Yeah, I'm really surprised, honestly, going back and looking at this picture now, because the colors are way off. But what was really interesting about this one, and it's unfortunate you cannot see it in the pictures, and I haven't looked in the Patricia Her book, the pictures might be better, but this one actually has a fiddlehead fern quilting. So it is not feathers, but it is a fern. And there were, I think, 2 quilts we looked at that had this fern type of quilting design, and it's very clearly not feathers. It's really slender. And I mean, it looks like a fern. So that was a surprise to me, because I really, kind of expected everything to be those feathers. And what she did say about this one is, and I think this was pretty much echoed in the big book, but while quilts like this, the H might have meant, or turned to the side, it's an I, might have meant something to other contemporary quilters, or, quilters of the same time period. The quilts with T's were often temperance movement. But what she said is this probably had nothing to do with, initials or anything like that. She says she just suspects that it was an interesting shape and layout. It's essentially a 9 patch where, the colors are made in strips because they're the same versus, all different. So. Okay, this one, our basket o' chips. This one, this is the one that has the mitered binding. And the theory, there was a woman there, and I don't know, maybe she worked for the museum, I'm not sure. But she suggested, and she didn't seem like, she asked some questions about quilting that kind of made me think she perhaps was not knowledgeable about quilting, but that she might be knowledgeable about like textiles, because she said she thought that the binding on this was definitely a replacement, that it was not the original binding. So, you know, and my friend said she wasn't sure. But you can see it's, the corner is just not as crisp as those 4-piece bindings. It just, you know, where they turn the corner, it kind of, it rounds it off. And oh, and there's our friend, the Filfat. So yeah, and I never asked why this one's called Basket of Chips and the other one's called Basket. These are chips, I guess. But that name seems like, I mean, this is a 1925 quilt. Chips would not necessarily be a thing in 1925, I don't think. I mean, potato chips. So maybe it's just chips of something else. I'm not sure. Something tells me that that's more of a modern, maybe a modern name for it, but who knows? Okay. And we saw 2 of the crazy quilts. So this one is number 14. So this one is the one that had front to back binding. So, and it's kind of hard to see, but they actually had, they had front to back, and then there was a very tiny thin, the feather stitch, or the turkey foot stitch, across the bottom. And I was correct that some of these shapes have stitching through them that does not connect the pieces. It's just a decorative stitch right through the piece. And one thing she said about, something kind of about the Amish is, the Amish do many of the same things that their English neighbors do, but they might do it 50 years later. So the fact that these crazy quilts that we saw were, we saw a 1925 and a 1938. And I think that the 3 we looked at the other day were this one and the other one I'm going to show you. And then, or actually, I may not have grabbed it. Let me see. No, I'm not sure if I grabbed it. But in any event, we know that historically the peak of crazy quilts in the United States was like 1885-ish. Whereas, 1925, 1938, this is way after this has gone out of fashion. So, but they still did fashionable, like quote unquote fashionable things, even if, they weren't wholeheartedly going into, all of the same activities their English neighbors were. So this one is the Goose Chase quilt. And as they had mentioned in the big book, Julie Silber's little blurb in the big book had said that this is very rare. And Patricia Hearst said the same thing. This is not something that they have regularly seen. In fact, this might be the only one that they've seen. Something that was also interesting about this one, and I think you can see a little bit better here, is that it has, and so I believe Patricia Hearst called this, let's see, she might have called this one also a fern, even though this one, to me, is a little more feather-like than the other one. The other one definitely looked like ferns, whereas this one just kind of has that same curve and sort of fingeriness as a fern. But what I thought was most interesting is, and I don't know if you can see it very well, but there are tulips on this one. And, I hadn't really seen I hadn't seen that on any of the other quilts, unless it's just not able to see it from the quilting. Or from the pictures. Also, something I noticed, this is not the only one, there's a number of quilts like this, that where they've quilted in the basket, they've just sort of quilted in this, like, sort of rumply line across the top that's indicating there's something in the basket. So, move this over a little bit so you can see. So it's just like there's no definition of what's in here. You're assuming it's fruit, but it's just kind of like the top outline. I thought that was also interesting. Not to say that that's something like, oh, only the Amish did that, but, I'm sure lots of other quilters did things like that, but I thought it was interesting. Also, I believe this chevron quilting here in the bars is also somewhat rare. Typically, they do, the grid quilting in those bars, and bars are very common. And let's see. Okay, this is the final crazy quilt. This one, let's see, 18. Oops. So this one actually, if this is the same one, has two pieces of fabric. Yes, two pieces of fabric that actually have a print. This one right here, and it looks like it's a stitch. So it's almost like maybe this was like a, not jacquard necessarily, or damask. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but it appears to be stitched on top of the fabric. So it's something decorative, but this is oddball. That's not something that you would normally see. And there's another piece of the fabric in here. You have the date, 1925. We definitely looked at this one the other day. Now I'm not seeing it. Ah, here it is. It's right here. So you can see a piece of it there. So it's just, the pieces are cut just small enough. It's kind of hard to tell what it is. But it's definitely not your average, fabric that you'd find in an Amish quilt. Also this one, and we noticed this the other day, that this one has a lot more decorative embroidery stitches than the other one. I think that's the big one, big stuff about this one. And then finally, this one we also looked at, but this one has an interesting history, and I'll get into how they brought the quilts back to Lancaster, because they didn't come back for free. They ended up having to raise money to buy them, essentially, to get them back to Lancaster. And one of the things they did was to sell adopt-a-quilt options. So the guilds put up money, like literally from their treasury, the local guilds, and then they also sort of passed the hat at guild meetings where people could just throw some money in towards it. And then they had an option where you could adopt a quilt, and when the quilts were put on display, there was a placard that would have the person's name on it. And this was a quilt that was adopted, and the woman who adopted it was there at the quilt turning. And it was so cool. She was like, oh my gosh, I'm finally getting to see it like in person after so long. And I guess she had visited it when it first came back. But at that time it would have been behind a glass case. So I think this may have been the first time she'd seen it outside of a glass case, and of course she couldn't touch it, but just to be able to look at it without the glare of glass on it, and to examine it up close. She was so excited. And I thought that was just the neatest thing. And I think if I remember correctly, what she had said was this was not one of the quilts that my friend had chosen to be part of the quilt turning, but rather the woman that had adopted this quilt had asked the museum if they could put it in with the quilt turning. So if I understood correctly, so that was pretty neat to see her just get so excited about this. So a couple of other things. I think probably the one biggest thing, and this goes back to no white, no yellow. So the theory about how the women came about putting colors together, sometimes, I don't think that this is true all the time, but the way that they would have gone about, some of these color combinations that are surprising, although they're surprising, was the idea that, in their bedroom, they used pegs on the wall to hang up clothing, and they would, the women might hang up their dresses. They might have 3 dresses that they alternate, and they'd hang those dresses up, and that would be the first thing that they saw when they got up, last thing they saw when they went to bed. And, just by virtue of, the colors of dresses that they had in their wardrobe, they see them hanging there. And it's in the same way that we often experience this. It's inspiring them, to create different color combinations. So that's the theory about, where some of these wild combinations come from, is that, it's in their clothing. They're already choosing fabric and again, literally buying it by the bolt. You know, it's not just like how we might go to a fabric store and pick out, you know, oh, I'm going to get 3 yards for this dress or whatever. It's, I'm going to buy a whole bolt and we have X number of things to make out of that fabric. So, you know, it may not just be their dress they make. They might make dresses for their children. I guess baby shirts for the men and boys. You know, siblings, family members might be together and sharing the fabric. So, you know, you just got again a very different kind of mindset. And I think a lot of this, you know, as I was hearing these things, it kind of goes back to the idea that, you know, the Amish faith is really, what's really important to them is community and not individuality. So even though women were expressing their individuality and creativity through their quilting, there's still just this mindset of everything around you is very community driven. And so, you know, the things that I think probably inspired them are more community based that they're taking to use individually versus the other way around. So, you know, she may have had a maroon colored dress and a purple dress and a blue dress. Probably all the other ladies in her community did too. But, you know, just, you know, having those 3 colors out and about may have inspired her. So, you know, just as an example. So I thought that was interesting. Let me see. I think, let me read to you just this little blurb out of the Patricia Her book, because I think she just really sums it up really well. And by the way, if you're just interested in Amish people in general, this book has got a really great introduction. It's not particularly long, but I think it's got like really good information. And again, she knew Amish people. She lived in their community. And, you know, she did a lot of work there. And, you know, not to say that Julie Silber is not knowledgeable about Amish quilts. I mean, she curated these, but she curated them from the perspective of Amish quilts in general. You know, and having studied Amish quilts for many, many years, whereas some of the other people that are doing, you know, research and writing about Amish quilts have actually lived in, you know, as neighbors of Amish communities and have interacted with Amish people and, you know, asked them questions. As an example, one of the people in the quilt turning brought up the question, well, what about that thing where they make a mistake so that, you know, in the eyes of God, they're not perfect? And she said, well, that's a myth. And in fact, and I think I had said this, in fact, it's kind of offensive to the Amish because, and she said, an older Amish woman that she had talked to, and she'd asked her that question, you know, what do you think about this? And the woman kind of like had turned her nose up and said, you know, I mean, frankly, that's offensive. I don't need to remind God I'm not perfect. He knows. So, you know, that, again, that whole idea of these quilts would be perfect if they didn't make that one mistake so that they're not, you know, as high up as the level of God. That's actually kind of offensive. And, you know, I go back to the same thing and really the story, I think, just based on what I've read, came to the U.S. at some point, you know, mid-century, where, you know, mid-20th century, they're talking about the Turkish rug makers. You know, they're attributing that to them. And it's the same thing. I seriously doubt any Turkish rug maker would say, oh, we make mistakes so that we're not perfect in the eyes of God. It's like, you know, I don't know where people come up with things like that. But they don't, there's not common sense in it if you really think about, you know, about those things. So anyway, let me read this little blurb in here. So this is about Chapter 1, the Esprit Quilt Collection of the Heritage Center Museum. Now, the Heritage Center Museum is the first place that the quilts went when they came back. And that museum is no longer around. It was in Lancaster. It was part of, it was like a Lancaster Heritage Trust, I think. Let me flip back to my notes. I wrote this down. Where did I write it down? Oh gosh. Okay, so there are 82 quilts. So it was an old bank building in Lancaster. And I know my friend called it a quilt and textile museum, but I think based on what is in Patricia Herr's book, it was a Heritage Center Museum, as was its actual title. And I don't know, it's not entirely clear to me. I don't think we really got the main points of how it went from there to Lancaster history. I don't know if they absorbed this other museum or if when the museum closed down, I'm not sure. It seems that they probably absorbed the collection. But oh, one other thing before I get into this is another one. This one might blow your mind. It didn't occur to me when I was looking through the big book and showing you pictures that there's not a lot of black in these. I think there was one quilt we looked at that had really vivid baskets, and it wasn't the basket of chips, but the other basket quilt we looked at. It had just eye bleeding pink and on a black background, but it turns out it wasn't actually black. It was very, very, very dark hunter green. And as it turns out, the Lancaster Amish did not use as much black in their quilts. Not to say they didn't use it at all, because they did. You'll see it I saw it pop up in a number of the quilts. But there's not backgrounds of black. That apparently is the Midwestern Amish do that. So, and I think just, so much misinformation over the years, and, people that haven't studied these and don't know as much about them will kind of lump it all together and say oh, Amish quilts, there's a lot of black in them. There's, these colors, etc. But, again, that's the Midwest. So Ohio, Indiana, I think there's a teeny little community in southeastern Illinois. I think the book also mentions, our friend Quiltish was here the other day, and she mentioned, up in Canada there was a group, and that's also mentioned in the book. So, but anyway, so from 2002 to 2012, all of these quilts, or half of the quilts were on display, and they were rotated for 10 years, a decade. And they cost $1 million. So let's get into a little bit of that. So let me read what Patricia Herr says. So this is kind of getting into, it's in the end of the first page of chapter 1. She said, when viewing the quilts in the Esprit collection, one must remember that these are not average everyday quilts that were simply transported from Lancaster Amish homes directly to the West Coast. Julie Silber was known in the trade as a discriminating and sophisticated buyer. Her client was not looking for just any quilt. He was not particularly interested in the cultural history of the object. That was interesting to me. Doug Tompkins did not really care that they were Amish. He only cared what the quilts looked like. So he didn't care about the cultural history, the person who made it, or the techniques by which it was made. To Doug Tompkins, each quilt was a work of art, and he made the final selection on this basis. And so moving on a little bit further, it says, from this large collection of Lancaster Amish quilts amassed by Tompkins, the 82 Esprit quilts illustrated in this publication were carefully selected and featured in an oversized 1990 picture book with text by Robert Hughes and commentary by Julie Silber, which you are already knowledgeable about because I've showed it to you. In that same year, when the Tompkinsons, so it was 1990, the Tompkinsons divorced and Doug Tompkins sold his interest in the Esprit Clothing Company, the Amish quilts went into storage. It was Doug's wish that this world-famous collection would continue to be seen by the public. Under the careful guidance of Silber, selected portions of the collection traveled throughout the United States and abroad to Japan, Australia, and Germany. So these quilts they've made it around. They've made it around the block a little bit. In the year 2000, when Doug Tompkins felt he needed funds for his activities aimed at saving the rainforest in Chile, he decided to sell off all of his quilts. Silber was determined to keep the group of 82 special quilts intact. With interest expressed by museums and auction houses throughout the country, it appeared this might not happen, that the collection might in fact be broken up. Fortunately, Silber contacted the Heritage Center Museum of Lancaster County in hopes that the quilts could return home to the place where they had been made. And so at this point, so this Heritage Center, Patricia Herr was involved in the Heritage Center, and I can't remember if I wrote down anything about what her capacity there was. Yeah, she was just she had a connection with the trust, Patricia Herr. And so basically what happened is Julie Silber worked with Patricia Herr, and it came down to the Lancaster Heritage Trust and this other buyer. And I think it was a private buyer who, I guess, just wanted the quilts. So it was between those two. And Doug wanted $1 million for them. 82 quilts for $1 million. Hey, Marianne. And if this collection of 82 quilts had been broken up and sold, the quilts sold individually, he would have gotten a lot more money for them. But this drive to keep them together, he understood the importance and significance of that and said, okay, $1 million for all of them. Well, of course, you know, the Heritage Trust being like a nonprofit, I guess, or a, you know, not an organization that had $1 million laying around. This is when they had to do the fundraising. But there was a woman, and there was no name attributed, so it might be that she was anonymous. This woman lent the Heritage Trust $1 million. And, you know, it wasn't a gift. It wasn't a grant. They had to pay it back. And they were able to pay it back within 6 months of the loan being made by the guilds reaching into their treasuries, guild members putting money in, and like the one that we just looked at, I'll go back to it, adopted quilts, and that allowed the quilts to come back. So that was the interesting, like really interesting story in it, I think, is that, you know, these quilts have been through a lot. And I would like to read this one thing that I didn't get to read the other day, and that's the Robert Hughes narrative that's out of the big book, because he's not an Amish quilt. He's an Amish quilt enthusiast, or was. I'm not sure if he's still living. I don't think he is. He was not an Amish quilt like scholar. He was an enthusiast, but he looked at these because he was an art critic. So he looked at these in a lot of the ways that I look at things, in that, you know, he's thinking about the connections, the theoretical connections to modern art. So I wanted to read that. But yeah, I mean, just seeing these quilts in person, I would say the experience to me was kind of interesting. They were smaller than I expected. Even though I knew the size, you know, you in your mind, you know, like, what, 79 inches, what is that? I don't know, is that like 6 feet? I can't do the math. It's a little over 6 feet, 7 feet. You know, but when you see them laying on a table and you can, like, kind of in your mind think about the size of a bed, they're like full-sized bed quilts. But being that most of them are square, they kind of, you know, they would be very striking on a bed, but still, you know, not this gigantic quilt like that we often see old quilts. The other thing that to really emphasize the fact that Amish quilt, okay, so 6.5 feet, thank you. Thanks, guys. So the idea that the Amish don't have this like extremely long history of quilting. The oldest Amish quilt, I think, that has been found, and I think I saw this in the Patricia Herr book, is dated like 1849. And I know that's old, but most are 1860 or later. So most are like kind of the heyday of the Amish quilts that would have been in this collection were, you know, like turn of the century, really. You know, like 1900. I mean, really a lot we looked at were 1900, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. Like, you know, these are relatively new by a lot of standards when we look at historical quilts. So I thought that was another really interesting thing. They did not come here with a history or a cultural desire to quilt. They came and they learned quilting from their neighbors, settlers and other people that they encountered as their neighbors. So, all right. So this is the beginning part of the big book, the coffee table book that was written in 1990, Julie Silber and Robert Hughes. And let's see. Yeah, so Robert Hughes, art critic for Time magazine, and author of The Fatal Shore and The Shock of the New, his history of modern art based on the television series that he originated and narrated. So this is what he says. To make a quilt, you take 3 pieces of cloth, top, bottom, and filling in between. Well, the filling in between is not a piece of cloth, Robert, but okay. And sew them together to make a kind of a padded blanket. A simple idea that leads to strange and exalted complications, takes thousands of woman hours, and has much to say about American history. This is a particularly, if not uniquely American form, an art based on strict modular arrangements, intricate geometry, luscious colors, and salvage, not wasting, making do. The quilt is where the desire for beauty and the moral scorn for extravagance used to intersect. And being made by women from colored cloth rather than by men out of nobler stuff, like colored muds and chemicals smeared on canvas, meaning painters, it has long been regarded as a somewhat minor art form. This archaic prejudice is not likely to survive a thoughtful tour of the collection that Doug Tompkins and Julie Silber have assembled for Esprit. The Esprit collection is not meant to be a historical survey of American quilt making as a whole. Rather, it concentrates on quilts made by one religious group, the Amish, and its particular field is the work of Pennsylvania Amish quilt makers. There are Amish in 20 states of the United States, but most of them live in the East in Pennsylvania and in the Midwestern states of Indiana and Ohio. To traverse this collection with open eyes is to realize that the quilt, especially the pieced Amish quilt, and more especially still the work of Amish quilt makers in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, between about 1870 and 1950, was one of the finest aesthetic forms in America. It was also a curiously prophetic form, even though the prophecy went without honor for so long. For where we have seen images something like these before, in much later professional as opposed to folk art, in the explicit geometries of the 60s and 70s, the stripes and targets of Noland, the concentric squares of early Frank Stella, and Sol Lewitt's grids, and the blocks of muted, saturated color employed by Bryce Marden. He's not even mentioned. Rothko, Jasper Johns. We've got lots of people here that he has not referenced. In the whole emphasis on seriality, repetition, and exalted emotional silence that was the mark of a certain phase of American modernism. Just as the dazzle of op art is prefigured, though with more subtlety than anything Vasarely or Anushkevich could produce in the 60s, in sunshine and shadow quilts, so the austerity of the center diamond in the square and center square designs may be allowed to evoke the words of the patron saint of American minimalism, Ad Reinhardt. And this is Ad Reinhardt's quote, "The creative process is always an academic routine and sacred procedure. Everything is prescribed and proscribed. Only in this way is there no grasping or clinging to anything. Only a standard form can be imageless. Only a stereotyped image can be formless. Only a formulaized, and that is sick beating. That's the word he used. Formularized art can be formula-less." He basically said nothing. And only an art critic would choose a quote like that basically said nothing. Puritan in its historical origins, yet permeated by myths of its own paradisical excess, American culture has always oscillated between bone and breast, the minimal and the maximal. These quilts can almost be seen as an unconscious effort to harmonize the two, a warm, soft, swaddling minimalism. But seen out of their original context of use, hanging on a wall, they make it very plain how absurd the once jealously guarded hierarchical distinctions between folk and high art can be. These aesthetically radiant objects have survived their forced transition from folkishness to the culture of the museum. They have done so, in part at least, because they are just a tad more aloof than most of the things that folk cultures produce. Folk art, like vernacular speech, may be whimsical. It is never inflated. It wants to be understood by everyone who sees it, and so it tends toward concision and practicality. It is filled with the marks of real social life, close to hopes, values, and aspirations that you feel you can read with trust because they have not been given rhetorical form. The period 1870 to 1930, during which most of the Amish quilts in this collection were made, was the last in which America had a widespread, vital, and self-sufficient pattern of folk culture that expressed itself in the visual arts. But the tradition only came to be valued when it was almost gone. Folk art went because folk art went. Part of America, old America, the primitive republic of independence and self-help, was disappearing, and its records had to be kept. Its forms would very soon be diluted and destroyed, and then revived as tourist emblems or nostalgic images by the inexorable pressures of the late 19th and early 20th century. Mass production meant buying things ready-made, first from peddlers and then at stores, instead of making them oneself. Uh-oh. Jared, are we glitching? Let me jump back here. Okay, things look okay on my end, so hopefully that was just a blip. Let's see, mass production, instead of making themselves. Isolated farms and whole hamlets found themselves drawn into the mainstream by traveling salesmen, cars, phones, radio, and the impact of the common imagery of the movies. Clans could no longer hold together. The pull of the larger community was too great. By the 50s, there was a whole popular imagery of folk stubbornness and folk displacement, running through the cult of Grandma Moses at one end of the scale to Ma and Pa Kettle and the Beverly Hillbillies at the other. Okay. Travel brought tourists who wanted the typical and the quaint, pressing folk art to become culturally self-conscious. Today, almost all folk art in America is meant to be bought by people from outside the community in which it is made. This is also true of the Amish, who, owing to their apartness, their binding sense of themselves as a group of the elect, whose survival depended entirely on not having much truck with the English culture that surrounded them, nevertheless held out longer than most. Quilt making was a women's art form. Not just something that women as well as men did, like sculpture or easel painting, but something mainly, if not quite only, done by women. Quilts made by American men do exist, but they are almost always made under special conditions: convalescence, retirement, imprisonment, or service on shipboard. Also by retired tailors, which I guess goes into the retirement category. All of these forms of confinement, an exception for men, but something much closer to normality for women. Some Amish men did try their hand at cutting and piecing quilts, but only when age or disability kept them from farming. They never seemed to have designed them. Although I'm trying to remember if I read somewhere about drawing designs. I don't think it was Amish. Ignore me. Some Amish men did try their they never seem to have designed them, but virtually all Amish women were quilt makers. I don't think that's true. Many Amish women were quilt makers, not all of them. Not everybody liked quilting. I mean, come on. Piecing, the assembly to a design of the patchwork surface of the top layer, and quilting, the assembly of the layers with tens of thousands of running stitches through the fabric, the lines of stitching laid out in the strictest order and pattern as a counterpoint to the piece design, were always done by women. The piecing and the design of the quilt pattern by the individual housewife, the finishing often by women in groups, gathered for the pleasures and mutual support of the quilting bee. By the 1880s, American women were struggling to make their professional mark on wider aesthetic fields. There were female students in most art academies, from Thomas Eakins' classes in Philadelphia to the ateliers of Paris, Cormans, Colarossi, Jerome's. Not one of them, with the single exception of Mary Cassatt, was going to have more than a peripheral effect on the culture of her time. There was no simple answer as to why this should have been so. Well, I can tell you why, sir. The idea that it was entirely due to hostile male domination of the art world is as naive and misleading as the patriarchal notion that women suffered from a communal, gender-determined lack of talent, a proclivity to taste but not genius. Well, the hostile male domination of the art world is a thing. It was a thing. It is a thing. It's still a problem. So I don't agree with Robert Hughes there. He's a critic. I'm an artist. So we can agree to disagree if necessary. Most art made by women, like most art made by men, is mediocre. Inside that framework, the fact that some painting was made by a woman no more places it in a special aesthetic category than the circumstance that it was made by a left-hander. Yeah, of course. Not until long after Georgia O'Keeffe's first one-woman show at the 291 Gallery in 1917 would that begin to change. It has not changed much. In folk art, which was produced and used outside the formal structures of the American art world, and the society it was trying to address in New York, Boston, and Chicago, the position of women was quite different. Women had always been accepted as primary creators of folk art. You know, there's also a nice way of saying folk art is craft, handcraft, right? There's lots of male folk artists too. In fact, I would say if you look at all the folk art books I have, I would say there's more women in there than in your standard like art history books, but it's still predominantly men. I would say it's probably like 60-30, something like that. 66-33, however you want to dice it up. Most of the finest works of art made by women in the late 19th century came from people who had no ideas at all about a career as professional artists, including the wives and daughters of Amish farmers. The trouble was that folk art, until about 50 years ago, I remember this is written in 1990, was not generally seen as art, or not as art that really mattered. I think it really was around this time, though, that folk art really skyrocketed. Not until the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Art Collection became the nucleus of a special area of study within the then New Museum of Modern Art, most of it was later transferred to Williamsburg, did the importance of folk art to American history become recognized. Folk art tells us a host of things about the common life of its society that was not raised by professional art, whether made by traditionalists or radical. It was not about superfluity or excess. Its purpose is not to give the official version. There is, of course, no such thing as avant-garde folk art, because small rural communities are intrinsically conservative and could not care less about the myths of the cultural future. The old is the best, and the new is of the devil. So I'm going to leave off right there. I think it's really interesting how he really does touch upon some things that, you know, I think are relevant. But I also think he like many art speakers of the art language back then, I mean, this was published a year before I went to art school. So, yeah, I think he's definitely got that. I'm an art critic. I'm up here, you know, Time magazine art critic. And, you know, spoken like a critic and not an artist, right? You know, they always say those who can't do teach. In the world of art, those who aren't good artists become critics. And by no means am I trying to say anything bad about Robert Hughes, but, you know, this is just the rhetoric that, you know, it is what it is, right, guys? So I want to show you one more thing. So so this is the part where I ask forgiveness and not permission. So bear with me while So what we have here is the back of an Amish quilt. And while it is, you know, it is not like, you know, out there, it is still something that surprised me. Now, this one's one of the more mundane ones. My friend said that until she got a chance to actually look at and handle some Amish quilts in the 80s, she had no idea that the backs may not be what one expects. Because again, what is really put forth is that, you know, prints are problematic. You know, things need to be, you know, plain and conservative. You know, bright colors are okay. But, you know, we stay away from printed fabrics generally. They do not wear printed fabrics in their clothing. You know, their clothing's very, very plain, lots of black. But the backs of the quilts, I think, must have had a little bit of, you know, if they're not going to be seen, it's kind of okay to use what you got. And I think in some cases, I think I just mentioned this a little while ago, I think it might have also just been about, you know, practicality, you know, especially if it's something that's not going to be seen. Maybe they could have gotten this cheaper, or, you know, they could have gotten it more abundance, or whatever. But they would not have made clothing out of this, any kind of clothing out of this. This is only for the back of the quilt. Look at this one. It's a little polka dot, like stripy looking little polka dot. I'm only going to show you a handful of them, but I was able to see the backs of every quilt. I took a picture of the backs of every quilt. And some of them were like a little dot or a little check, like a very tiny microscopic gingham. Like this one was a sort of like a herringbone type check. Whereas this was, so like this I think is like probably a polished cotton, or at least a sort of a satin weave. Whereas this I think is, you can see, I think this might have been a wool, like a very fine. And the thing about the wool, and although I was not able to touch these, you could kind of tell by the loft of the fabric. And especially where you could look and see like a lighter colored fabric that was butted up against a darker colored fabric, and you could see the shadow of the seam allowance. These wools, you just can't get this kind of wool anymore. I mean, it's like gossamer wool. It's so thin, and they're clothing fabrics, but they're still like, you know, so many of the fabrics that you buy today, and, you know, I mean, it's impossible to find 100% wools really without spending an arm and a leg. But even the wool blends that you can find, if you made a garment out of it, would be a coat or pants. You know, you're not going to have something like drapey, right? So, yeah, that was another thing that I think really struck me. And it's not that I didn't know that there were these really fine drapey gossamer wools. I just, you know, it just didn't click until I saw them, you know. So my friend did say that these are all pretty sedate. She said she did see at one point something that blew her away. She said it was like some bright floral print that would have been like, you never would have guessed that she'd find something like that in an Amish household. She also said she's seen some that used feed sack. So, I mean, again, you're thinking 40s and 50s, that a lot of these, you know, many of these quilts were made towards the end of that period, so the 40s and 50s. And that's when you could get feed sacks, and certainly they're running farms. They got animals to feed. You know, while they may grow some crops that get fed to the animals, they would also have bought animal feed, so they'd get those bags. And I mean, you know, a thrifty people, they'll use what they've got. So now none of them that I looked at had feed sacks on the back, but she said she had seen that. This is a morning print. Again, it's very sedate. It's not flashy, but it's still like it would not be appropriate for an Amish woman to make a dress out of this. But okay on the back of the quilt. And what was interesting, I don't think it was this one, but it was another one that there were like two pieces of fabric on the back, and they were very complementary. But one was kind of a solid, like almost like chambray. You see like denim or chambray, that it's kind of got that, the two color weave kind of look. There were a number of backs that were like that. And so the one I'm thinking of, it had sort of a morning print, and then like this big piece of this kind of like black or gray chambray. So again, that just really speaks to, being thrifty. And I mean, aren't we all a little thrifty when it comes to, quilts are expensive to make. You're gonna, what you put on the back might very well be a very thrifty choice. This one was interesting. I don't think my camera picked up the color very, very well, but it was this really brilliant, like royal purple with these little red triangles scattered all over it. And like, very vivid. I don't think that my picture is doing it justice. That one I was like, whoa, look at that. And this, I mean, certainly they use red. Now, the one thing I did notice, and my friend confirmed, they tended not to use these bright turkey reds. And the time period when turkey red was like a big thing, the Amish were not necessarily like quilting at that point. So the reds that they used were the synthetic dyes that were used in wool and then later on in cotton. And so those solids you'll see are more of like a maroon or kind of like an orangey rusty red. This is a bright red. And so you don't see the wools necessarily this color. You'll see them more orangey, like, and they tend to pop, I think, and seem brighter because they're surrounded by, say, like blue. If you surround a bright orangey red with blue, it becomes like blinding. There was one basket quilt I mentioned, that the baskets or the top part of the basket was like this, like, it make your eyes bleed pink, like pink, neon pink. But it was from the 30s. I think it was like 1935 or I don't think it was 1940. I think it was definitely the 30s. And I kept thinking to myself, where'd they get this fabric in the 30s? Because it looks like neon fabric. But then I kind of, in my mind's eye, I can't touch the quilt, but in my mind's eye, I kind of like one eye looking at that. And I'm thinking, okay, it's a bright pink, but I think it's made more bright pink by the fact that it's surrounded by this very dark hunter green, or it could have been black. It was a hunter green, but it could have been black, and that is what makes that look so shocking. Whereas if that pink was set off by itself, I think you might say, wow, that's a bright pink, but you wouldn't think of it as being so like just make your eyes bulge. And then this is the last one I'll show you. So this is like a sort of a herringbone plaid kind of look. I think the quilt that this was on the back of, I think was, standard 1930s, 1940s, so standard 1930s, 1940s type of fabric. So yeah, maybe you guys aren't as surprised by this as me, but I was gobsmacked. I was like, what? Now again, some of them had, like lavender, bright purple, tan, green, like all kinds of different colors. And you could imagine that those were just other fabrics that they had or that they purchased, but these prints were just really surprised me. And the idea of that they really could put some decorative qualities into these quilts and sort of express their creativity in ways they couldn't do with their garments. And this, because this was something that is utilitarian, even if they make this beautiful fine quilt and it is only ever put out on special occasions, it is still a utilitarian object, and that makes it okay to kind of go a little wild with decorativeness. So all the bright colors, the beautiful quilting, etc. Whereas, and, you know, like I said, I'm thinking, you know, the prints are, because they're available, they're not on clothing, they're generally hidden. Another interesting story she told me, which is kind of off the subject of quilts, and she and I were just chatting off to the side after the turning, but she said that, you know, they don't have pictures on their walls. You're not supposed to have graven images. And that goes back to the whole thing about how Amish don't like, you know, they don't want to have the picture taken. I think that's not something that is, you know, I don't think they're going to run away from people, but they're not going to stand there pose for pictures generally. Because they, you know, they don't believe in the graven image. But other types of pictures might be okay. And nobody's going to stop them from having a calendar in their kitchen. And so they could go, you know, grocery store, bank. Well, and actually they didn't do banking. They had their own banking, but you know, at a time when grocery stores, banks, your dry cleaner, everybody was giving away calendars. And I think some businesses do still. I get the calendar magnets. It's like the thing. But, you know, at one time, lots of businesses gave away calendars, and it was, you know, with their business name information on it. It was just like a little gift to keep them front and center of your mind all year long. And so the Amish people could go and get, you know, these calendars, and they were allowed to hang them up in their kitchens. And I think she said, I don't know if it was a story she had heard or if she had actually been to this person's house, but she said they had like a dozen calendars hanging in their kitchen. Because it's pictures that they were allowed to have displayed, whereas, you know, other things they couldn't. Oh, your small town grocery gives out calendars with recipes. That's cute. I love that. I think calendars are great. I mean, you know, like we live by the calendar on this. And I sometimes just like to have a pretty calendar that I can just glance at. And I have a calendar in my kitchen. You know, it's a paper calendar. It's the Quilt Folk, or no, it's not Quilt Folk this year. This year it's Fiber Arts. It's their calendar, but yeah, those are nice to have. So anyway, I just thought that was so interesting. And of course, you know, they wouldn't be able to accept it. They would not accept a calendar with people. It could be like landscapes. Maybe kittens and puppies might be okay, but no people. So I just thought that was so interesting. And it's something that kind of... it reminds me of some of the things I've read about, like the Orthodox Jewish population, and it's sort of these workarounds they find for being able to continue to exist, observing their, you know, their religious observances, but in this world that is increasingly becoming difficult, you know, like, you know, and I mean, as far as decorativeness, I mean, the Amish, just because everything outside of their homes and communities is decorative doesn't mean that they have to do that. But they're human. They're human just like us. It's, you know, just because they're a different religion and they live a very different lifestyle, they're still human. People still want to express themselves. They still want to look upon pretty things. You know, it gets very depressing to sit in a, you know, a blank room. So being able to have these little pops of decorativeness, I think, are important to them. So... and that is the Amish quilts. I really, if you are interested in Amish quilts, and I would say I have a ton of Amish quilt books now. But I gotta say, probably if you were only gonna buy one, I think I would say get this Patricia Her book, because I mean, it is specifically the 82 quilts of the collection, but it's a very famous collection. They are supposed to be like, you know, the best of the best in terms of design. They're not necessarily the best of the best in terms of quilting skill. Now, a lot of them are stunning, the quilting in them. But others, I was actually surprised to see there are some issues in some of the others. A couple pictures I took, and I can't show you those because, oh my gosh, Marianne, yes, you should. Definitely share that with us over on Quilt Nerding. I'm sure you're part of the Quilt Nerding Facebook group, aren't you? If you're not, go request and get in there and post it. That would be so cool. So yeah, and like I said, going back to the fact that, you know, reading this little snippet from Patricia Her, you know, Doug Tompkins, he really didn't care about the makers. He didn't care about the Amish, you know, as a community per se. He cared about the way these quilts looked and how from a decorative and artistic standpoint, what they looked like. And so, yeah, like some of the pictures I took, there was at least one or two where there was some rippling going on the, you know, because they weren't densely quilted. And so there was a little bit of rippling going on where maybe the quilt didn't quite lay flat from the piecing. So there were things like that that are really not apparent in the books. Like whatever they do in those pictures, they you know, stretch the quilts tight. You can't see that stuff, but when they're laying on a table, you actually can see some of those funky little things. So the one thing I'll leave you with that I also thought was interesting about these is these particular quilts. I don't know how they were displayed necessarily at the Esprit headquarters. I think quilts were just kind of all over. But particularly for the Heritage Trust, you know, when they got the quilts and they were displayed in this museum, they were displayed in these cases that it had like it was almost like an easel, a very narrow, you know, kind of angle, and there'd be a quilt on either side, and so you could walk all the way around and see, you know, both quilts that are back to back. They had two quilts displayed like that, two quilts from the collection. I think they rotate, so you could see what those cases looked like. But I guess the way that they're attached in those cases is with Velcro, and so when the back of the quilts are completely lined all the way around, just inside the binding with this really wide Velcro, and so that I think that's like they put it on those flat easel like things, you know, and they're at a tiny little bit of an angle, and then I think they can use that Velcro to kind of stretch them out tight and get, you know, it looks more like a painting than it does like a quilt hanging on the wall. So I thought that was also interesting, and I think that's part of why in the pictures they look so perfect, because they're stretched tight, whereas if it was hanging, you'd kind of be able to see the ripples and where it doesn't lie flat, etc. So and like I said, you know, I've never been to the Louvre, but you always hear about people going to see the Mona Lisa and being like, oh. And not like in a bad way, but just like, oh, you know, it's so much smaller than you expected, or it's just, you know, you have this all built up in your mind, and then you're like, oh, well, you know, it is what it is, you know. And that's kind of how I felt about these. I mean, I loved looking at them. I'm so glad I got to see them. I hope at some point I get to see more of them, you know, from the collection. I'm hoping maybe they'll have a show again at some point. But yeah, just standing there looking at them on the table, I was kind of like, oh, you know, it's like, oh, they're smaller than I expected. They're a little more ripply than I expected. All right. We have been missing good old Mavis. So let us get into some Mavis Fitzrandolph. All right. So I'm going to put up one of the quilts that I think is pretty nice in this section of our reading. And let's see. Let me put this down here, so just in case I could keep an eye on the chat. And okay, what did I do with the text? Okay. All right, so we had left off kind of in this section about, you know, putting together the quilt, and she got into this very long section about batting. And so kind of left off, I think, sort of in the middle of that. And she talked about how the rural industries scheme, they were really... they really pushed the use of wool because, you know, that's a local thing. So let's see. Okay, so I'm probably gonna reread a little bit that we already read, but I just want to make sure that it's kind of clear. So Wool is unquestionably a warmer material than cotton, but new cotton wool or wadding in its fluffy state should be effective in holding warm air. It is generally agreed, however, that a wool padding remains springier after washing. Cotton tends to felt and flatten so that the quilt pattern is difficult to see after much laundering. I think I remember, like, you know, this is that's what happens. And the quilt's capacity for holding warmth must be diminished. Wool is generally a lighter material than cotton, but the amount of wadding used in a quilt does not weigh a great deal more than a similar thickness of wool padding. For instance, a full-size quilt, thinly padded, would need 9 yards of wadding, weighing about 2¼ pounds, or from 1¾ to 2 pounds of wool, thickly padded in the old-fashioned style. It might have as much as 24 yards of wadding, 6 pounds, or 4 pounds of wool. Lightness of weight was not always considered an advantage, for many quilters of a former generation definitely aimed at something heavy to put on the bed. And I think I mentioned those heavy old quilts that people would like not even be able to turn over when they're under them. The outstanding advantage of cotton wool or wadding is that it is bought ready for use. Sheep's wool must first be thoroughly scoured to remove dirt and grease. It can be bought clean, scoured for quilting, from some of the Welsh woolen mills, but even then it may need further washing. It must next be carded to lay the staple evenly and then spread bit by bit on the material, being carefully scrutinized for dark specks of grease which would make marks on the quilt. A good deal of time must also have been spent picking the hard seeds out of the early cotton wool, for they are liable to interrupt the passage of the needle. But even so, this padding must have been less troublesome to deal with than wool, and that probably accounts for its popularity as soon as it was easily available to the ordinary village or farmhouse quilter. Possibly, too, many quilters found difficulty in getting suitable wool to line their quilts, for it should be soft, not coarse, and lamb's wool is best. Some Welsh wool is suitable, but not all, and for instance, the wool from Weardale, a great quilting district, is said to be much too harsh. The Rural Industries Bureau urged the use of wool in quilts made for their marketing scheme, but no suitable supply could be found in the north, and it was sent from South Wales to quilters in County Durham. They returned to wadding after the close of the Bureau's scheme. In South Wales, wool seems to have been considered too valuable for use in ordinary quilts, except by those who had their own source of supply. Mrs. Lewis of Lanarth, for instance, preferred to use it and always kept some of her own lambs and used to card it with her fingers in the evenings to avoid wasting daylight. Mrs. Thomas's uncle, who worked in a blanket mill, brought home wool combings for the quilts. I was told in Pembrokeshire that old people would go round the fields collecting wool from the hedges to take with their material to the quilter, buying more from a farmer if they hadn't gathered enough. I doubt whether this was a common practice, for anyone who tries it will find that it takes a great deal of walking, or a number of years, to gather the 2 or 3 pounds needed, and then many hours of persistent work to free it of rubbish and dirt. Several Welsh quilters who always used wool said they had no difficulty in getting it from local farmers. An old blanket was a popular padding in Wales and was sometimes used in the north of England, where I have also heard of one cover being quilted onto a new blanket, making a quilt of only 2 layers, having only one right side. A Welsh quilter used worn blankets, which had originally been made from her own sheep's wool. Sometimes wadding was laid in over the blanket to make the quilted pattern stand up better. A certain very rough quilter said firmly that only winter quilts had a blanket filling. Summer quilts were interlined with 2 old sheets. Another told me that a best quilt with sateen covers would be padded with cotton wool and 2 sheets, and a Westmoreland woman said that sheets were used with old blankets. That's crazy. So 2 sheets, an old blanket, and then your top and your back. That's a lot to quilt through. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm assuming maybe the blankets are to keep to keep this like the surface of the blanket from being inflated. I don't know. That's interesting. Mrs. Beatrice Scott, a Northumberland woman, wrote in The Craft of Quilting, and that is by Beatrice Scott, by Dryad Press, 1935. I don't know that I know that book. I'm going to have to look for that one. So she wrote in The Craft of Quilting that an old blanket and an old sheet would be put aside with pieces of print for making a quilt. Others have spoken of putting muslin, pieces of old pinafores or cheesecloth on each side of cotton wool padding. Now the cheesecloth, that is kind of that idea of scrim to kind of keep it from shifting. Like it's sort of got like a, sort of a substrate to kind of grab onto. Sheets and other cotton materials can hardly have added to the warmth of the quilt, so presumably only weight was aimed at. Muslin has sometimes been used over dark-colored sheep's wool to prevent it from showing through a thin silk material. So that makes sense to me in terms of like the sheets. If your material is not very heavy, that, to keep from showing through. But maybe if the blanket had a pattern like woven into it, maybe that too. But yeah, I don't know. That's a lot. Sheep's wool is sometimes used in the form of domette, and that's spelled D-O-M-E-T-T-E, a manufactured woolen lining material. It is expensive, but has all the advantages of wool without any trouble in preparation, and is excellent for interlining dressing gowns and other garments, or any quilted work in which the utmost lightness and warmth are of prime importance. Certain other lining materials made of vegetable fiber have been tried, but they have various drawbacks and nothing to recommend them in preference to cotton wool or wadding. So I'm assuming vegetable fiber, I'm sure there's lots of different kinds. I'm picturing corn husks, but I don't think that's what she means. I'm wondering if she means things like, milkweed. Like milkweed, it has the little dandelion like things. I've seen quilts that use that. I'm wondering if that kind of thing is what she's talking about. But is there anything else that like fluffy, soft vegetable fiber? I don't know. I'm not sure. Medicated or surgical cotton wool should never be put in a quilt because, having been treated to make it absorbent, it would tend to take up any dampness from the atmosphere and would be very difficult to dry after washing. The fact that quilting has become a thrift craft by means of which the very poorest households could sleep warm is illustrated by the use of rags for padding in South Wales. The quilt was the ragman, wrote Mrs. A.E. Evans of Carmarthenshire. Everything that could not be worn any longer was washed, unpicked, and pressed, and then put in the quilt, fitting every piece tidy, and remember not to have any lumps. Then old sheets or old blankets. Others have mentioned pieces of old clothing and woolen stockings split open, and shirts probably made of Welsh flannel. One family saved all their woolen cast-offs for the village quilter, Mary Pantag. I think her name's been mentioned before. The seams were cut out and it was pressed and used in 3 layers. And very hard it was to sew through, as Mari's apprentice remembers. Well, no shit. Every layer you put in there is more difficult. I can hardly bear to think of the annual wash day for these quilts. The wet weight of this conglomeration must have been appalling. I love that. The wet weight must have been appalling. This conglomeration. For stitching these thick and heavy quilts, stout linen thread or strong cotton, and she specifies number 10 or number 20, had to be used, and one old quilter is described as rubbing her thread with beeswax like a cobbler. So that's interesting that she says that, because I'm wondering then if beeswax was not commonly used. Here in the U.S., with old sewing baskets, you always find a little chunk of beeswax in there. And fancy waxers were definitely a thing that was in, sewing, like the fancy sewing kits and sewing, like the etagers that you could find, etuis that you would find in France. They had like a little beeswax thing, so... But honestly, I don't use beeswax down the entire length of the thread. I only use beeswax to thread the needle, because it makes the tip of the thread stiff. So that's interesting that she's acting like that's an anomaly. Many a Welsh quilt in its extreme old age became the padding for a new one. When one considers the amount of work which goes to the making of a quilt, even when it is not closely stitched, and the cheapness of the materials in general use some 50 years ago, it is remarkable that every old Welsh quilter will mention the work of recovering. A few quilters in County Durham, Northumberland, and Westmoreland also spoke of it, but I think it was not so general there. One Welsh woman even said that print quilts were recovered many times over as the surface got worn out. The stitches were unpicked, and sometimes the old covers were removed entirely, and with new material or a freshly made piece of patchwork, the quilt was remade. Only the padding was saved at the cost of immense labor. One Welsh woman considered this worth doing for a blanket that was not for wadding. Okay, that makes sense. Like, I don't know that I would want to do all that just to recover. Like, I mean, once it's washed, I mean, just think about, like, these quilts. The cotton's kind of all clumpy. It would be a mess to take it apart. But it makes sense for a blanket. I actually have one quilt that's got a blanket inside that I started to unpick just to see what it looked like, and I stopped. But it might be interesting to display that, to uncover it further. In the North Country, the old quilt was more often used, as it was, for padding, 2 new covers being put over it and quilted. It must have been very tough sewing. I have seen one which merely had a new top cover sewn in a simple pattern of stitching, which did not go right through, so that the original pattern showed on the underside. A Northumberland woman machines the new covers in a very simple design. In any case, quilters generally disliked the job of recovering, and many spoke of it as unprofitable. The payment seems to have been the same as for making a new quilt, which was much less laborious. It is difficult to understand why any quilter ever undertook the more complicated kind of recovering, unpicking the original stitching, unless it was to oblige regular customers from whom more profitable orders could also be expected. The fact that it was done so often in Wales is evidence of the value of all materials and the constant need for thrift in their homes. One reads occasionally in articles on quilting that thistledown was used as padding. Oh, that's interesting. I have never heard of this from any quilter, but it was told by someone who was intrigued by the idea and started to collect thistledown, that after she had assiduously gathered it throughout one summer, she had a bag of dry material which was very heavy, though it had shrunk to small bulk and had no fluffiness or resilience. Thistledown, in fact, is quite a different sort of substance from cotton wool, and I doubt whether it was ever used to pad quilts. The twisted silk used to pad the quilted haketon of Froissart's Knight may have been specially suitable for protection in battle. I have not found any other mention of its use. So, I'm wondering if this is what she's saying, I don't know, the vegetable materials, like, okay, if nobody, she hasn't heard of anybody using thistledown, like, what is the vegetable material? I guess there's got to be something I'm not thinking of. Yeah, so let's see, this is skipping ahead a little bit, but let's look at these pictures. So this one, I wanted to put this up because you can see, I think it's got wear on it. Like, you've got serious wear on these. I think that's why we can see it so very well, what this looks like. But look at this beautiful medallion in the middle, and I wonder if some of this is stuffed. Let's find out. So this is a quilt by Mrs. Armstrong, Northumberland, who says she got the idea of the center pattern from one marked by Elizabeth Sanderson. The shells and hearts alternating around the feather star, the true lover's knot in the middle, and the feather hammock used with these same units in the border are well-known traditional patterns. So I'm guessing what she's calling a hammock is actually a swag, right? So these are and I guess this is a true lover's knot. It's a shame that It's really a shame that we can't see these in color. Because I don't know, this just looks to me like it's either very, very thick padding, batting that she can get like that, that denseness in the quilting, and so it puffs up, or maybe there is some stuffed, some trapunto here, potentially. I don't know. And then this one also, my goodness, look at this. You can see there's a really pretty medallion there, and then you have these big, like, alternating medallions. And you got that, there's a spiral in the border, and these orange peel type shapes. These are all very, very Welsh. And so this says a characteristic Welsh quilt by Miss Katie Lewis of Glamorgan, one of the younger generation of Welsh quilters. Units include leaves, roses in outer border around the center, and wine glass. And then check this out. Look at this. So did we not look at a feathered, diamond within a square, a feathered diamond within a square of an Amish quilt? This is what's so fascinating to me is and I've read an article about it. I think there was a paper. I can't remember if it was in AQSG Uncoverings or if it was in another publication, but there is this theory that there is, some kind of visual connection between Welsh quilts and Amish quilts. And, I don't know that they've really, like, the hypothesis is really interesting, but I don't know that they've found anything specific that would say, like, Amish people, picked up quilting based on Welsh quilts. Because the Welsh quilts do predate, Amish quilting, or are contemporary too. So it's kind of an interesting thing to say, like, well, did these things kind of spring up separated, and, spring up fully formed in two separate places? When you look at the fact that, the Welsh communities were different. Even though they're geographically connected to the English, to England, they were kind of a community unto themselves in a lot of ways. And there was prejudice and ill treatment of Welsh people, same thing with the Irish. And there were Welsh settlers that came to the US. So I have some in my family history. So who knows? I don't know that there was like a lot of Welsh settlers in eastern Pennsylvania. So I don't know. But it's interesting because you look at this and you can look at some Amish quilts that are identical. And the fact that they also used wool, so, not to say that lots of American quilters used wool, but specifically Welsh, specifically Amish, a lot of wool quilts and a lot of dense quilting and a lot of very similar medallion type of layouts. And in this case, we looked at one identical to this the other day. This I love because these baskets are so funky. Like, look at them. The handles are obviously appliqued and they're kind of all a little wonky. And I think it's also because the piecing of the baskets themselves is a little wonky. I don't know if it's just that the quilt isn't laying quite flat, but you've got some wavy lines in here. But nonetheless, I think this is a really cool quilt. You see it's got some really dense quilting in here. Some of this distortion might just because the quilt is like, it's got a big fold line. But what great baskets. My mom actually has a very cool basket quilt that the baskets are kind of elongated. This reminded me of that, and they're all purple on a white background. This one obviously has a darker border, but I thought this was really neat. And then I think that's it. Yeah, that's it for a little bit. So we will, you know what? I didn't read you guys who made this basket. So let's read that and then we'll end here. So this is Patchwork Quilt in Baskets pattern made by Mrs. Armstrong, Northumberland, for the wedding of her daughter, Mrs. Smith. We don't know her name. We just know she married a guy whose last name was Smith. The quilting fits into the patches and the patterns. The quilting fits into the patches, and the patterns include clematis and grapes, signifying plenty and prosperity. That's lovely. All right. Well, guys, I think we are going to leave off there. And we will get to the next section, which is the covers. So the top and the bottom. And yeah, she gets into some interesting stuff here too. So I think that I'm enjoying the things that she has to say, because although I realize that this is English and Welsh quilting, and you can't necessarily compare that to what was happening in the US, I still think it's interesting to look at the time periods, and you get a sense of the kinds of the garment fabrics, the types of fabrics, even if they're not garment fabrics, although most of the time they were, and just the things that they were doing versus what we've seen here in the US. It's just so interesting. So I hope you guys are enjoying this. Okay, so tomorrow, normal day at Quilt Nerding. I think we have a couple of more. We're not going to start our next book until after we're back from seminar. So it will be November before we actually start the next book. So we got a few more things to look at, but join us tomorrow, 7 p.m. on YouTube, Quilt Nerding. Or I'll be back on Thursday. Thursday will be my last day streaming for a little bit. Okay. So, I'll remind you guys again on Thursday, but I'm going to have that blackout period of about 3 shows. And I'll be sure that I've put like the schedule change up here on Twitch. So just don't forget about that. And, I'll remind you again on Thursday. So have a wonderful week, you guys. I hope you got some fun things planned. Get your pumpkin spice latte on, or whatever brings you joy in the fall. And I hope that it's sweater weather out there for some of us. Not quite here yet, but getting close. So I will see you guys soon. Have a wonderful afternoon and a wonderful week. Mwah!